Today's daf is daf mem tes, and you may recall that on the bottom of mem ches amid beis, we had a whole discussion about a needle that was swallowed by an animal, and the question is, which which track did it take? Did it take the track through the esophagus, through the veshet down to the digestive system, and then the animal's considered a treifa because no doubt that the needle punctured one of its intestines, or perhaps it took a different track and it came down through the trachea. And Rav Ashi said that what we should do is we should look at the needle and we should see which side. The needle has two sides. It has the blunt side, which is the head of the needle, and then it has the sharp side, the point, and that's, of course, the part that pierces. And Rav Ashi makes the following distinction. He says that if you find the position of the needle in such a way that the head of the needle, which is the blunt side, is outside the liver, because apparently they found the needle when they, after the slaughtering, they found it in the liver. So if you find it on the outside of the liver, then the assumption is that it couldn't have come from the liver itself, because the assumption is that the blunt side of the needle would not be able to exit from the liver. It's not sharp enough. So therefore, you'd have to assume, since you found the blunt side on the outside of the liver, that the liver entered into the, I'm sorry, that the needle entered into the liver, having come through the digestive tract, and therefore the animal's trafe. But if, on the other hand, what you find is that the sharp side of the needle is protruding out of the liver, then you assume it came from the liver, which means it came through the trachea and came down to the bronchi, and then from the bronchi to the liver, and then it exited with its sharp side out of the liver, and therefore the animal is kosher. So the Gemara now, this is where we ended yesterday, is going to object to this analysis of Rav Ashi. So the last few words on Memches Amid Beis, Umay shno mimachat, shenimtzeis biovi beis hakosos. So there's another case where they found the needle protruding from the beis hakosos, which is again one of the parts of the digestive system of the animal. It's called the reticulum, Anyway, so here we're not going to make the distinction of Rav Ashi. What does Rav Ashi add over here? So that we left out one point that we finished up yesterday, but I forgot to mention it today. I'll try to fill in the blanks here. That Rav Ashi makes a distinction between two needles. There's a small needle and a large needle. So the small needle could possibly um, exit from the liver, even from the head of the blunt side of the needle. And yet, in the case of a brisa regarding a needle that was found in the base hakosos, the only distinction that we're going to find is where is it protruding from? Now, again, you have to know a lot more about the base hakosos than we know, but apparently the base hakosos, like many of the parts and organs of the kishkis of the animal, has a double wall. So now the question is whether or not the needle penetrated through the ovi base hakosos through both walls. And it depends, according to the Brisa, on how you found the needle. If you found it protruding from one side of, uh, meaning from the inner side of the wall of the Beis HaKosos, that's kosher. Because then you don't assume that the nekev, right, that the piercing was through both the inner wall and the outer wall, which would make it treifa. So it only protrudes on one side, and therefore it's kosher. Mishnei tzdadim treifa. If, on the other hand, we see that the needle that was embedded in the Beis HaKosos protrudes from both sides of the wall, which means that it penetrated through both, let's call it, for the lack of a better word, I'll call it membranes. But yet the Brisa doesn't go into the question about whether or not, as Rav Ashi would have had it, you found, in, let's say, the case of a larger needle, you found the blunt edge out, or you found the sharp edge out. V'lo Amrina, the Gemara says, we don't find in the Brisa the following distinction. Let's check out ikupa lebar, ikupa legav. Which direction is the kupa, meaning the needle, facing? Is the head of the needle protruding outside, which means that the needle could have come through that system, which we call the trachea system, or is the needle facing the protruding towards the inside, which might mean that it came through the digestive system. So now the Gemara adds another element to the equation in order to defend Rav Ashi, and that is that Hasam, in the case of the Ovi Beis HaKosos, Kevan de Ika Ochleru Mashkin, right, when the animal eats or drinks, then the food comes through the Beis HaKosos, the reticulum. And now we're going to say that that even though the needle is head first, but ema olchun umashkin dachku, meaning the whole premise of Rav Ashi is that if the needle is head first, then it couldn't have come out because that's the blunt side of the needle. But here in the case of the Beis HaKosos, the Gemara argues that the full contents of the Beis HaKosos, meaning the Ochlan Mashkin, they might have pushed the needle, even though head first, and it went into the wall of the Beis HaKosos. In the case of the needle in a liver, where there is no Ochlan Umashkin, so there's nothing that would give a little push to the needle, then Rav Ashi is right that the needle would not be able to come out of the liver, which again is as a result of the whole Chad Gadya through the root of the Veshet, I'm sorry. So the root of the blood system, meaning through the trachea, um, and therefore Rav Ashi says it must have come through the digestive system if the blunt end of the needle is protruding out of the liver. Hahu machta de ishtakach bisimpona rabba de kavda. So until now, we've been referring to the symponos of the rea, of the lungs. Those are the bronchia. But now we're referring to other blood vessels in the liver, right? Every organ of the body has to be supplied with blood. So we're talking about the great blood vessel of the liver. He gives you the fancy Latin for it. It's called the vena cava. And they found a needle in that blood vessel of the liver. And Huna Mar Breid Rav Idi Tarif Rav Ado Bar Maniomi Machshir. So we have Machlokes Hamoraim whether or not we assume that this needle came through the liver or it came from the outside into the liver. If it came through the liver, then we understand Rav Ada that the animal is kosher. If, on the other hand, it came from the outside, it means came through the digestive system, then we understand Huna that it's treif. Also, Shaili Ravina, the question came in front of Ravina, and Ravina was absolutely convinced that the halacha is like Rav Ada Bar Minyomi and the animal is kosher, and therefore he made a declaration regarding Huna that Shkilu Glima, take away his cloak, which has a value on the market, to Trofai, because he declared that this animal is treif. As a result of his ruling, the owner of the animal, sold it for the dogs, meaning at a cheaper price as a treifa. And therefore, by posketing that it's treif, he actually caused a financial loss to the owner of the animal. Let's take away his cloak as payment to compensate for the loss of the meat. Hahi kashisa dishtakach b'mora. Again, we found something protruding, in this case, out of the gallbladder. What was a kishaisa? Kishaisa is a date pit, the pit of a date. Now, the pit of a date is relatively blunt. I'm not sure why that's called blunt, but later on we're going to have the case of a pit of an olive, which is sharp. I mean, Rabosa, you fellas, you probably have some dates in the house and some olives in the house. If you have, just check for bugs first in the case of dates, but put the two pits together on the table, one near the other. I didn't do the experiment, but anyway, the Gemara is assuming that the date pit is blunt and the olive pit is sharp. Omar Avashi. Ki avina beirav kahana Omar, right? A statement of the yeshiva of Rav Kahana. Havadai, in this case, where he found the date pit in the gallbladder, vadai simpona nokat v'asoy. In other words, we can be machshir the animal and assume that it came through the air pipe, the windpipe, and through the vascular blood system. Afalgav de lo konafka, meaning what's the size of the pit? It's a larger pit, and it's so large that it couldn't have exited from the liver. Now, until now, we've been assuming that if it went through the vascular system, through the air pipe, etc., through the bronchial, then it would have exited from the liver. And yet this date pit could not, because of its size, could not possibly have exited from the blood vessels of the liver. And yet they were machsharit. Now, if it didn't come through the liver, meaning through the vascular system, then obviously came through the digestive system. It should be treif. So the Gemara explains, mirbal hu de rabile. So just like before, we saw that the food and the liquids in the reticulum push the needle out, so too the Gemara is assuming that the movements of the animal somehow are able to shake down this large pit and force it through the very narrow opening of the liver, and it came out of the liver. And again, I think what the Gemara is saying is that even though it seems unlikely at the face of it that this is really what happened, but nevertheless, since the date pit is blunt, as we said, therefore it's hard to accept that would have come outside the liver and entered in through the liver and get to the gallbladder. And therefore, the Gemara is going to now differentiate between Hanibili Didikla, the date pit, which, as we said, was blunt, and therefore we don't believe that it came through the digestive tract and pierced through the liver into the gallbladder, but Bezesa Mivla Baza. In the case of a pit of an olive, which is sharp, then it could have pierced its way all the way through the digestive system into the gallbladder. And therefore, we assume that there's a nekev in the intestines and the animal's treif. Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Now we have a slight agadita. When I learned this piece, I was hoping that we'd get away with an agadita for a change here in Pele Perkel Treifus. But unfortunately, it's the shortest agadita I've ever seen. Anyway, Lama Nikres Shma Reo. We always try to find significance in the name. Now, I don't know, do you gentlemen eat lungs? I don't know. I asked my wife, do we eat lungs? I don't know. No, we don't eat lungs? All right. I guess maybe in the old days they ate lungs. I mean, I don't know why we don't eat lungs. Maybe they don't taste good. I don't know. Anyway, Sheme'ira Seinayim. So if you eat lungs, it's good for your eyes. So maybe that's why I don't have such good eyes, because I never ate lungs. I don't know. The Gemara now has a suffix. Is it the lung itself that's good for the eyes, or only when you metabel, when you add herbs? Like the herbs are back in those days, and even today, and I think the Rambam writes about that in his medical writings, that the herbs have certain medicinal powers. So if you add these herbs to the lungs, then the combination of A plus B is good for your eyes. I think if I asked my eye doctor this, he would throw me out. But anyway, fine. Tashma the Omer of Huna Bar Yehud. Now the Gemara is going to try to prove that the lungs are healthy for the eyes only if they are mixed with medicinal herbs. because Rav Huna made a statement that avaza bezuza v'rea dida ba'arba. Very strange situation over here. If you want to go to the store and buy an avza, today there's a whole issue about geese, whether we, because apparently a lot of the geese are trephus. They force feed the geese because they're very small, so they want to make it bigger. Anyway, I eat geese. That's my minig. There's a very good place. I don't know if it's still here, but up the block here in Arnov that sells geese. Anyway, you pay a zuz for a geese. Now, in the goose, what you'll find is the rea, the lungs. And if somebody were to sell you just the lungs of the goose, then he would charge you 4 zuzin. Now, ve'isal kedaitich la'achila, if you're going to tell me that just the lung itself, without any additional herbs, is healthy, then why the heck would you pay 4 times the price when you can simply buy the entire goose and eat the lungs of the goose? Linko bezuzi v'lechol ela al yidei simonim samanim. It must be that you'll pay 4 times the price of the goose for the whatchamacallit, for the lungs, because they cook the lungs together with these medicinal herbs. So again, I was hoping that, but I didn't look at it. Anyway, we go on with Elu Trefus. In Nakfa Rea, okay, so there's a puncture in the lungs. Now, watch what happens over here. The butcher starts poking away at the lungs. That he does after shechita, apparently to maybe chop up the lungs into small segments. I don't know. But now you found a puncture exactly where in the lungs the butcher would normally make a puncture. So now you have to know whether talinon applies or talinon doesn't apply. What is talinon? Talinon means that we could say if we found a puncture exactly in the place where the butcher will customarily puncture, then we could say that this puncture that you find was after the shechita, and therefore there's no problem. The animal's kosher. If you hold low talinon, then you have to say, well, I don't know. Maybe these punctures were there when the animal was alive, and the animal was indeed a treifa. Is Rav Ada bar Nosan Omer Talina, Mar Zutra Bereder Rav Mori Omer Lo Talina. Now the truth is that in order to understand this sugya, you really have to know a velt, because the sugya of Talinon appears over and over again in Shas, and basically the kishkis of Talinon is the sugya of Chazaka. So how do we view this animal after the shechita? Do we say the chazaka is that it's innocent until proven guilty, it's kosher unless you know for sure it's treif? And then we could apply the principle of talinon, and we're going to say, well, now you find something pierced in the lungs. Well, you know what? Talinon, that happened after the shechita. The butcher did his thing. That's not a problem. But if, on the other hand, you would say that we can't apply chazaka to shechita because we don't know whether the animal was treif or not treif, and now we have a reusa in that chazaka, even if I grant you that there is a chazaka, but now we have punctures in the lungs, then the burden of proof is on you to prove that it's kosher, therefore lo talina, hilchas talina. But the Gemara paskins that we do apply the principle of talina, meaning we assume the animal is healthy. The shechita, therefore, was a valid shechita. It was not a treifa. You found punctures in the lungs. That's because the butcher, subsequent to the shechita, punched away. Amar Shmuel Berei Rabbi Yafo. In other words, the Gemara's conclusion of talinon is not universally accepted, not so pashut. because Abba, so Rav Shmuel testifies about his father that he was one of the, excuse me, the organizers of what's called the Yarchei Kala, which is the public lectures that took place before the Moadim. Meireshi Kala de Rafram Hava. Rafram was one of the great, I think he was an Amora, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if he tell you here or not. Um, but I think it's a fair assumption. Rafram was one of the Amoraim, and he used to give those lectures, those drushes at the Yarchei Kala. And Shmuel says that my father, Rabbi Avo, was one of the organizers of that Yarchei Kala. The Omar, and he said Talinon. So it sounds like he's boasting in order to give his father a certain status in halacha, which might mean that since his father organized the kala, he certainly was mishamesh talmidei chachamim, and he learned from Rafram all the laws. Amru kamei lacha demar zutra brei derav mori velo kibla. Now, if you remember, in the previous line in the Gemara quotes Mar Zutra as saying lo tailina. So when Rav Shmuel testified about his father that he held talinon, and he said it in the presence of Mar Zutra who holds lo tailinon, and nevertheless, we don't find that Mar Zutra changed his mind. He didn't rescind his original position. Omer of Mesharshia, kavase davua di abba mistabra, dotalina bezev. So we had another opinion, which was the opinion of Rav Ada bar Nosson, and now Rav Mesharshia is agreeing and accepting Rav Ada bar Nosson and the view of the Rabbi Avo, the father of Rav Shmuel, because Rav Mesharshia quotes his grandfather, Avua di Abba, who is of the opinion that we apply Talina. And that's the more logical way to go. And the proof of it is da Talina Bezev. Whoa, this is strange. Talina Bezev is a chumrah to declare and determine that the animal is treif. We're trying to use Talina to prove that the animal is kosher. Now, what's Talina l'chumrah? If you find somehow that the intestines of the animal after shechita was, I don't know, like disappeared, so to speak, and then you find it and you notice that there are puncture holes in the intestines, then Talinan means we're going to assume that these puncture holes were a result of the fact that the wolf put his claws into the intestines and then shot into the intestines a certain venom. So this is a Gemara back on Daf Tes. The wolf ran off with the intestines of a slaughtered animal, then returned, and they're found to be punctured. Now, when did this puncturing happen? Did it happen before the shechita or after the shechita? It's the fact that the wolf put its claws into the intestines after the shechita, that's irrelevant. So again, I stand corrected here. He quotes Rashi to the effect that Talinon Bizev is a kula, not the way I said it. Yeah, which makes sense because we don't know that these holes were pre-shchita holes. And therefore, we're going to be Talina Bize'ev, who ran off with the intestines after the shchita, and therefore the animal is kosher. Murna. Okay, now we get into the sugya of worms. So we have a lung, and it was punctured by worms. Is pligi bar of Yosef bar Dosoi v'Rabbanon. Chad omer kodem shchita parash. When did the worms puncture the lungs? Was it before the shchita or after the shchita? And if you hold kodem shchita, the animal's treif. Chad omer liachar shchita parash. That the worm punctured the lungs after the shchita, and therefore the animal is kosher. Now, I'm not sure if this is the identical sugi of Talina, but it sounds very similar, and it's brought down right near Talina. Now, the Mishnah quotes Reb Shimon, Ad Shetinokev. So Reb Shimon holds that everything that we've been assuming until now is not necessarily so. We assume that there's a puncture in the lungs, then the animal's treif. He's saying no. It depends how far down the puncture went. And it's got to go all the way down to the onos, to the bronchi. So I think that this is a kula because it's not enough to establish its treif according to Shimon if it goes down to the bronchi. No. It's got to go down to the primary bronchus, which is called Simchon HaGadol, the Great Symphony. Just joking. Anyway, Yosef Rav Acha bar Abba Kamei de Rav Huna. The Yosef Kamar Omar Rebbe Maluch. Okay, now we have someone by the name of Maluch. Not sure where he came from. The Gemara is going to talk about. And Rabbi Malach quotes Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, one of the first generation Amoraim, that halachic Reb Shimon, which is a great kula, because it's not so that every puncture in the liver automatically establishes the animal to be treifa. So this is all going on Kamei de Rav Huna, in the presence of Rav Huna. Amaleh. So Rav Huna turns to Rav Acha, who's apparently giving this whole presentation. Malach arva ka'amra. Apparently, there were two Amoraim with this very same Maluch name, the same name. And it seems that Rav Huna denied this tradition that Rav Maluch could have possibly transmitted the halacha that we follow Reb Shimon, because no. This is a Maluch, again, a different Amora who came from Arvia. And I happen to know that there's a transmission in the name of that Rebbe Maluch from Arvia who says that Ein Halacha Rav Shimon. Kisalik Rav Zera, right? Rav Zera was one of the Babylonians who made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Ashkechei l'Rav Bibi di Yosef v'Ka'omar Omer Rabbi Malach Omer Rabbi Shimon Levi Halacha Rav Shimon. So here, Abzera hears from Rav Bibi a tradition like the one that we had before in the name of Rav Acha, that Rav Yeshua ben Levi held that the halacha is Kirab Shimon, all in the name of Ramalach. Amalei Chaye Demar is Lashon Shvua. Danov Rabbi Chia Barabba Rav Asi Ikleinan LaAsri de Rabbi Malach. We chanced upon Rabbi Malach the Amri Le, and we asked him, "What exactly do you hold?" They're quoting you this way, they're quoting you that way. Give us the bottom line. I Omar Mar Aloch Reb Shimon. Did you actually say that? Omar Lon en Haloch Reb Shimon Amr. I said the exact opposite. That the halacha is not like Reb Shimon. V'atma biyadach. So I guess Reb Bibi asks Reb Zera, what tradition do you have? Amalei ha'amar. I have the opposite tradition of Yisrael Reb Shua. That halacha Reb Shimon. But at the end, the Gemara says, "Ein halacha Reb Shimon." Okay, Nikva Akeva. So now we're getting into the Kishkas. Now, if we had a whiteboard, we should write on the whiteboard here, because if we're translating into English, then Keva is called the Abba Masom, which I guess is the main stomach. But really, our sugya here is about Chelev. And the Torah, with regard to Chelev, is quite complicated. This is in Vayikra, Perek Gimel, Pasuk Gimel. And again, the introduction is that any chelev that is burnt on the mizbeach is osur b'achilu with a chiv kares. And the Torah says, "Es hachelev hamachase es hakerev, ves kol hachelev asher al hakerev." So there's one category of chelev which is called machase es hakerev, and there's another category of chelev in the same pasuk, in the same breath, that is asher al hakerev. In the English here, he says the fat covering the innards, and then he has the fat that is on the innards. So the whole sugya now is the fat that covers the keva. As we said, the keva is the abomasid. Now keep in mind that when the Kohanim were around in the old days, they used to give the keva of Chullin as a gift to the Kohanim. Now this fat that covers the keva is chelev al gabi keva Kohanim nagu bo heter. In other words, not all chelev is also. There's a lot of chelev that's mutter. Again, I don't think we know today exactly, how to separate one chelev from the other. That's called treibin, but we don't really do that anymore. But back in the day, it was a great thing if you could paskin that the chelev that surrounds the keva is mutter, that it's not classified as the chelev that's burnt on the mizbeach. And they were noig bo heter ki Rabbi Yishmael. Now the Gemara is going to later on change that it's not Rabbi Yishmael at all, but rather it's Rabbi Akiva. But right now we think it's Rabbi Yishmael. Sha'amar mishum avosov. Now keep in mind, Rabbi Yishmael himself holds that the chelev hamachases hakeva, or shall we call it shal gabe hakeva, to be more precise, is also it's chelev mamish, but he had a tradition in the name of his avosov that enochinami, that this keva is the fat that covers the keva is mutter. So they sort of like owed a debt of gratitude. The Kohanim owed a debt of gratitude to Rabbi Shmuel by quoting his predecessors who held that they could eat that fat. I guess the fat was worth something. V'simonech, this is very cute. Yishmael kahana misayel kahane. The Yishmael, who's a Kohen, Rabbi Shmuel was a Kohen, and he helps out the Kohen by telling them that they could eat the fat that covers the abomasin, the cave. Maihi, where is this Rabbi Shmuel? Desanya. Because we have a brisa. Ko sevarchos b'nei Yisrael. Now, the Kohanim are blessing the people of Israel, but who's blessing the Kohanim? Is Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Lamanu brachel Yisrael mipi Kohanim, but l'kol amatzim lo lamadu. Kshu Omer vani avarchem. So the extra two words vani avarchem in Parshas Noso is not referring to God bestowing the power of the Kohanim to be Mavarach Yisrael, but rather on the power of Hashem to be Mavarach the Kohanim themselves. Hevi Omer Kohanim Mavarach Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mavarach l'Kohanim. Sounds like a pretty good deal. But Rabbi Akiva has a different shot. L'amanu brach Yisrael mipi Kohanim, mipi gvur lo l'amanu. How do we know that when the Kohanim bestow a bracha, then indeed that bracha is going to come from Hashem? God is basically saying that they do the Maisa bracha, and I will bring down the bracha from Shamayim. Hevi Omer Kohanim Mavarach Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu maskim al yodam. So now what the Gemara is saying is that we only have a proof that the Kohanim get a bracha from Hashem from the interpretation of Rabbi Shmuel. So the Kohanim owe a debt of gratitude to Rabbi Shmuel for the fact that Rabbi Shmuel, interprets the pasuk in a way that guarantees that the Kohanim will get a bracha. Ela Rabbi Akiva bracha l'Kohanim inole. Rabbi Akiva can't deny. There's no reason why the Kohanim shouldn't get a bracha. They're giving a bracha to Klal, so they should get a bracha too. Amar Rav Nachbar Yitzchak, we go back to Avraham Avinu. Avarcha mivarachecha. I will bless those who bless you. So the Kohanim bless you, bless the people of Israel, and Hashem says, I will bless the Kohanim because they bless you. So on the side, we thought the American government was blessing the Jewish people, so God would bless the American government. But I don't know if that's so. I have my doubts. Anyway, Umay Misayeh, no politics here, right? Umay Misayeh Kohanim. So now, according to Rabbi Akiva, how does the Kohanim help how does Rabbi Shmuel help the Kohanim? I'm sorry. According to Rabbi Akiva, that the Kohanim will receive a bracha. So now I don't need Rabbi Shmuel. Forget about Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva, like Rabbi Shmuel, agrees that God will bless the Kohanim. So why did the Kohanim owe a debt to Rabbi Shmuel? And the answer is going to be because of the fat that covers the keva. So Rabbi Shmuel, Sha'amar Mishum Avos of Maihi the Sanya. And now we have one brisa, and this tradition is that Rabbi Shmuel is Mekil, and he's Matir in the name of Avosov, the fat on top of the keva. Then we're going to have another brisa that says Pumfaket. It's Rabbi Akiva who's the one who's Matir, the fat on top of the keva. Ve'esachelev asher al hakerev. The pasuk that we read before in Vayikra Perek Gimel, and now we turn to Daf Memtes Amid Beis.